Hello, and welcome back to Relative Time. When it comes to brands that have been suggested or requested that I take a look at, Deep Blue is at the top of the list. And if you're not familiar with Deep Blue, they've been around since about 2007, so I think they're one of the oldest micro brands out there. It's usually suggested I take a look at them just based off the sheer number of different models they have in their collection, but also the different variety of dials they have for each of those models. It's just kind of astounding. And I've really been eager to take a look at one for myself for some time, and I've come close to buying a Juggernaut or a Defender a couple of times. But I never quite got around to getting one. There just always seemed to be something else on the horizon that I wanted to work on first. So it was a real pleasant surprise when they reached out to me recently and told me they had something they wanted to send me. And what they sent was a Divers 1000 model with their brand new Blue Sandstone dial. There are actually two different versions of the case, one at 44mm and this one at 40. Although it's actually a little bit larger than the specs say. The case is 316 stainless, and it actually has a surprisingly good finish to it, which is the first thing I noticed when I picked it up. It's just incredibly smooth to the touch. It has a brushed finish throughout, and I don't think there's actually a single polished edge on the entire thing. I know the phrase tool-like gets thrown around way too much, and I do that as well, but it really is the best way to describe this. And it's a really interesting case as well, and you can see this from the side profile, where you can see how far those lugs drop down, and this kind of spherical curved edge that just seems to jut out from the center. And that edge does line up with the bezel and just kind of accentuates the curvature of it. But it also makes measuring this just a little more difficult. The case is supposed to be 40, but if you actually measure the bezel, it's 40.2, and the case sticks out just a little bit beyond that. So if I measure from the 2 to the 8, it's more like 41.8. So going straight across, I'd have to guess it's around 41.5. And that's without the crown. Width is also a little more complicated because of the Helium Release Valve. Ignoring it, it's about 46.2, but with it, it's 47.5. And one quick word about that Helium Release Valve. Do you really need it? Not at all. I think there's only a handful of people in the world who'd actually use it, but it is kind of cool to have. One thing I really like is how the crown guards just kind of come out of that rounded edge. They aren't overly big or tall, but it does add a bit of visual appeal to it. And I like how they just don't jut out, but are actually rounded as they come out. Another thing that makes this watch wider is just this oversized signed screw-down crown at the 3. It is pretty easy to get a hold of and manipulate, but I think it looks a little off visually. The brushed finish on it doesn't quite match the brushed finish on the crown guards, which I think one of the reasons a lot of companies polish the top edge of the crown guards is it's not going to match no matter what you do. So if it is going to look off, you might as well do it on purpose and make it look a little nicer. So the Divers 1000 is already going to be a little larger than you'd expect, and it's not a true 40. But it is in line with a lot of the other popular divers out there these days. And the lug-to-lug of 49 kind of goes with that as well. It's a little longer than I'd like, but still manageable. Where things start to really get out of hand is the total thickness. Deep Blue lists it as 15mm, and it might be that without the case back, but when I measured it, it's actually right at 16. So it's pretty tall, and one of the reasons, and a possibly unnecessary reason, is the crystal on the case back. It sticks out just a bit, and it not only visually looks odd, but you actually feel it as you wear it. That said, other than the crystal, I think the case back is actually really nicely done. And one of the reasons I'm really talking about the case here is because the sandstone dial really isn't going to be for everyone. But Deep Blue has a surprising and just surprising number of dials that you can put in this case, including some pretty unique ones. So the bottom line here is that this is a really well-made case. It's just a bit bigger and bulkier than I'd like, which some of that can be forgiven, but not all of it, because it does have a 300-meter water-resistant rating, and a really good price. I believe the MSRP is $249, and that's with the silicone strap. It's an extra $83 if you want one of the bracelets. But there are some real steep discount codes available for Blue, and a lot of them have been around for a while. I think the code DEEP has been around for about a year now, and it gives you 40% off, which should bring the price down to about $150. That's actually really good for a real diver with a Seiko movement and sapphire crystal. Plus, I did notice that there's now a Gen 2 version listed that comes with a ceramic bezel for the exact same price. And the bezel is just done right here. It's 120 click, unidirectional, and not much backplay. It's made of a brushed steel that just really matches the case, and in some ways just kind of blends into it. And this one does have a black aluminum insert with a Lume pip at the top. It's just always easy to get a hold of and rotate. There's very little resistance, which is then followed by sharp sound and feel. Now, you do have a flat sapphire with AR, and it sits above one of the more interesting dials I've ever run across. The color of the sandstone dial just completely shifts depending on the light. Sometimes it's almost black, and other times it's a navy blue, although there's always just a little bit of that glint going on. I've seen a fair amount of textured dials in the past, and most of them are from Spinnaker. And depending on the color, some of those can look a bit plasticky. But the sandstone is just completely different. It really does look like sandpaper, although with just a little bit of sparkle. It actually reminds me more of the gold sand Lume in some Genoa. But where there it's just restricted to the indices, here it's like the whole dial. In real life, it's a bit more tame than this is appearing, and really doesn't look like a vampire from Twilight. This dial is really going to be hit or miss with you, it just kind of depends. And I can see how some would really like it, and I actually like how it's done, but I'm just not really sure it's for me. While I actually really like the effect on the Genoa, there I think it's kind of a less is more situation. But regardless how you feel about it, it does make for a really unique and striking effective dial. The indices are not very tall, and they stick out maybe a millimeter above the dial. Yet the polished framing with the white Lume centers just really stands out against it, which then the whole thing is just framed by this white painted chapter ring on the outside. In fact, looking at it as a whole, it is a bit subby-like. Now, for the hands, we do have simple swords, along with an orange lollipop second hand. And that second hand is just a great choice, not only by adding some needed color, but it's just really visually eye-catching against the design. While the minute and second hand are a good size and length, the hour is a bit narrow and short, a bit more than I'd prefer. I think in some ways they're really trying to emphasize the minute hand here, as if you are diving, it is the most important thing. The font for the dial text is small, but there is a lot of text here, as well as just a simple cutout for the date of the 3. So it's just a classically styled dial layout, and it really just comes down to how much you like or dislike the sandstone texture. The big question I had was really on the Lume here, and the Lume is relatively good. One of the things you first notice is that the Lume on the dial isn't near as good as the hands. And that stays true throughout my comparison test. The dial fades away much quicker, but the good news is that the hands are pretty close to the Seiko turtle next to it. So I would prefer it if the Lume on the dial was just as good as the hands, but if you are going to compromise on something here, then the dial is the proper choice. Now, movement-wise, we do have a Seiko NH35, and we've seen it many times before, and it's really just a great workhorse movement. And pretty much the best choice for a watch in this price range. It's a standard beat rate with hacking and hand winding. The watch came with a silicone strap, but Deep Blue also sent me a Jubilee bracelet to try on with it. And they're actually both pretty good options. For the bracelet, the finishing might be just a little rough, and especially at those right angles are just a little sharp. But overall, I think it's actually pretty good for the price. It has solid end links and a pretty good milled clasp. And I definitely think it's better than most of the Orients and Seikos you'll get at this price. The only thing I really didn't like about the bracelet is that it does hang out a bit from the clasp, which does effectively increase the lug-to-lug. But I do love the way the solid end links look on it. And the watch with the bracelet is a little heavy, so if you tend to wear it a little loose like I do, it might flop around a little bit and feel top-heavy. Which is why I think I actually preferred wearing it on the silicone strap. Not only does it make it a little lighter, but I think it gives you a more comfortable and tighter fit. The ends are molded just to fit the case perfectly. It's a pretty good quality strap. It's soft, comfortable, and branded with their logo. So not much else I can say on it. Except there's one thing I should mention about both of those. that if you take either of them off to use some other strap, just have some patience when you put them back on, because it's truly a pain in the ass to get them back on. You have to get everything lined up just right because of those deep lugs, and even then you might need some brute force to get the spring bars back in the hole. So you got some good and a little bit of bad, which I think actually describes the watch as a whole. But overall, I think the good does outweigh the bad here. At this price, there's always going to be some kind of compromise going on, so it really just depends on what you want and what you value the most. If you're looking for something that's bold and has some presence without being overly wide, then this could be a good choice, but you might sacrifice a little bit of comfort. Otherwise, if you want something more conventional, there are some great options from Seiko and Orient, but they might have some lesser specs. Either way, I think it gives a good impression of what Deep Blue can produce. And I kind of get the sense that rather than make dive-style watches, they're really putting an emphasis to make watches for those that really love to use and abuse their watches in water. But let me know what you think about the Divers 1000 and about Deep Blue in general, especially if you think it needs a better name. Divers 1000 doesn't really roll off the tongue. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.